In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers walked into the Ural Mountains and never came out alive. When search teams finally found their bodies weeks later, what they discovered was so disturbing that the Soviet government sealed the case files for decades. Some of the hikers were found nearly naked in negative 40-degree weather. Others had massive internal injuries with no external wounds, as if they'd been in a car crash. One was missing her tongue and eyes, and the tent they'd been sleeping in slashed open from the inside, as if they were desperate to escape something so terrifying they'd rather face certain death in the frozen wilderness. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, and after 65 years, we still don't know what really happened on that mountain. Let me take you back to January 1959. A group of 10 students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute assembled in Sverdlovsk, which is now called Yekaterinburg. These weren't amateur weekend hikers. They were elite athletes, experienced mountaineers who trained for years. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a fifth-year engineering student known for his meticulous planning and cool head under pressure. The group included 8 men and 2 women. There was Lyudmila Dubinina, a 20-year-old economics student known for her infectious energy. Semyon Zolotaryov, the oldest at 37, a mysterious veteran who joined the group at the last minute and seemed to have a shadowy past. Rustem Slobodin, the group's comedian. Zenaida Kolmogorova, a serious student everyone called Zina. Alexander Kolovatov, a physics student. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishchenko, both engineering students and best friends. Georgy Krivonishchenko was a construction engineer, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, who had French ancestry and was known for his strength. Their plan was to reach Otorten Mountain, a challenging Grade 3 trek that would earn them a prestigious mountaineering certification. The route would take them through some of the most remote terrain in the Soviet Union. They departed by train on January 23rd, then by truck on the 25th. On January 28th, one member, Yuri Udin, fell ill and had to turn back. He would be the only survivor, and he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the question of what happened to his friends. The remaining 9 continued into the wilderness. For days, they made good progress, documenting their journey in diaries and photographs. Their final entries described difficult weather and deep snow, but nothing their experience couldn't handle. On February 1st, they began ascending the slopes of a mountain called Kholat Syakhl. In the language of the indigenous Mansi people, this name means dead mountain. They should have camped in the safety of a nearby forest, but for reasons we'll never fully understand, they decided to set up their tent on the exposed mountainside instead. That night, something happened. Something so terrifying that it made 9 experienced mountaineers do the unthinkable. Here's what we know for certain. At some point during the night of February 1st or the early hours of February 2nd, all 9 hikers cut their way out of their tent from the inside, not the exit, mind you. They took knives and slashed through the canvas walls. They fled into the sub-zero darkness wearing little to no clothing. Some were in their underwear, some had only one boot. They left behind their coats, their supplies, everything they needed to survive. They ran downhill toward a forest about a mile away, and then, one by one, they died. But nobody knew any of this yet. The group had told their families and the university sports club that they would send a telegram from the village of Vichy once they returned, which should have been around February 12th. When that date came and went with no word, people weren't immediately concerned. It was common for expeditions to run late. But as more days passed, worry turned to alarm. On February 20th, nearly 3 weeks after the group's last known position, search teams were finally organized. Volunteers, police, military, and local Mansi hunters began scouring the wilderness. On February 26th, they found the tent. The search team couldn't believe what they were seeing. The tent was still standing, partially collapsed under snow, but intact except for those deliberate cuts from the inside. Inside the tent, everything was still there: food, warm clothes, boots, money, documents, cameras. The hikers' personal belongings were laid out as if they'd been preparing for bed. Some items of clothing were neatly folded. There was no sign of a struggle inside the tent, no blood, no damage except for those slashes. But outside, leading away from the tent, were footprints. 8 or 9 sets of footprints preserved in the snow. Some were barefoot, some were in socks, some wore a single boot. The prints showed that the hikers had walked, not run, in an organized group down the slope toward the forest. There was no sign of panic in the footprints themselves, which made their lack of clothing even more baffling. The searchers followed the prints downhill. About half a mile from the tent, they found the first signs of the hikers' fate. Under a large cedar tree at the forest edge, they discovered the remains of a small fire, and there, frozen and partially covered in snow, were the bodies of Yuri Krivonishchenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both were dressed only in their underwear. Their hands showed signs that they tried to climb the cedar tree. Branches were broken up to about 15 feet high, and their hands had cuts and abrasions. Here's where it gets stranger. Someone had cut clothing from these two bodies. Pieces of their garments had been carefully removed, presumably by the other hikers who were still alive at that point. Between the cedar tree and the tent, searchers found 3 more bodies over the next few days. Dyatlov, the leader, was found about 1,000 feet from the tent, positioned as if he'd been trying to crawl back to it. Zina was found about 200 feet closer to the tent, also positioned as if she'd been trying to return. Rustem Slobodin was found between them. All 3 were better dressed than the 2 Yuris, wearing clothes that had clearly been taken from the others. All 3 appeared to have died from hypothermia while trying to make it back to the shelter of the tent, so 5 bodies had been recovered, but 4 hikers were still missing. Where were Ludmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolovatov, and Nikolai Thibault-Brignol? The search continued for 2 more months. Finally, on May 4th, the remaining 4 bodies were discovered in a ravine about 250 feet further into the forest from the cedar tree, buried under 13 feet of snow. They'd clearly tried to create a shelter, digging into the snow and laying down branches and clothing to insulate themselves from the cold. But these 4 hadn't died from hypothermia. And this is where the Dyatlov Pass incident transforms from a tragic mountaineering accident into one of history's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies was a man named Boris Vozrojdeny. He'd seen countless bodies in his career, examined victims of every kind of accident and violence. But what he found in these 4 bodies shook him. In his official report, he wrote conclusions that would baffle investigators for decades. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a massive skull fracture, not from a fall or a blow from a person, but from something with tremendous force. Semyon Zolotaryov had 5 broken ribs on the right side of his chest, and Ludmila Dubinina had 4 broken ribs on the left side. But here's what made the examiner's blood run cold. These weren't simple fractures. The force required to cause this damage was equivalent to a high-speed car crash. The ribs were broken inward with such violence that both Zolotaryov and Dubinina had punctured lungs and massive internal bleeding. Yet there were no external wounds, no bruises, no cuts, no signs of a physical attack. Their skin was intact. It was as if some enormous pressure had compressed their chest without leaving a mark. Vozrojdeny wrote in his report that the force required was beyond what a human being could deliver. He compared it to the impact from a car crash. And then there was Ludmila. 20-year-old Ludmila Dubinina, found kneeling against a rock with her face pointed upward. She was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her upper lip, and some facial tissue. The medical examiner determined these were missing before she died, not removed by scavengers afterward. She'd also been found wearing Semyon's hat and Yuri Krivonishchenko's pants, which had been cut off his body. The official investigation began to crumble under the weight of these impossible findings. The lead investigator was a man named Lev Ivanov. He interviewed witnesses, examined the evidence, and tried to piece together what could possibly explain these deaths. Nothing made sense. Some witnesses reported strange orange lights in the sky around the time of the incident. A group from another hiking expedition in the area reported seeing glowing orange spheres floating over the mountains on the night of February 1st. Even some of the search and rescue team members reported seeing strange lights during their search operations. Ivanov would later, years later after the fall of the Soviet Union, claim that he'd been pressured to close the case and that he believed something beyond conventional explanation had occurred on that mountain. The official conclusion? The hikers died from what the report called a compelling natural force. That's it. No specifics, no explanation, just an unknown force that somehow made experienced mountaineers flee their only shelter, caused massive internal injuries without external trauma, and led to 9 deaths in one night. The case was officially closed in May 1959, and the files were sealed and sent to a secret archive. They wouldn't be available to the public for decades. So what really happened on Dead Mountain? Let's go through the theories, and I'll tell you why each one either does or doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Theory 1, avalanche. This is the explanation that many modern researchers favor. The idea is that a small avalanche or slab slip hit the tent during the night, causing panic and forcing the hikers to cut their way out. This would explain why they fled without proper clothing. They were terrified of being buried. The injuries to the four in the ravine could have been caused by a second avalanche or a fall. Here's why this doesn't quite work. First, the tent was found still standing with all the supplies intact. An avalanche powerful enough to cause those massive internal injuries should have destroyed the tent. Second, the slope wasn't steep enough for an avalanche according to most mountaineering experts. Third, there was no debris field consistent with an avalanche, and most importantly, some of the hikers walked over half a mile away from the tent, lit a fire, tried to build a shelter, and attempted to return. Why wouldn't they at least grab boots or coats if the immediate danger had passed? Theory 2. Infrasound. This is one of the more scientific explanations. Under certain conditions, wind passing over mountain terrain can create infrasound, low-frequency sound waves below the range of human hearing. Infrasound can cause feelings of extreme anxiety, dread, and even panic in humans. It can cause nausea, chest pressure, and an overwhelming urge to flee. Some researchers believe the specific mountain shape and wind conditions that night could have created infrasound that drove the hikers into a panic. This actually explains a lot: the irrational fleeing, the sense of immediate threat despite no visible danger. But it doesn't explain those massive internal injuries. Infrasound doesn't break ribs. Theory 3. Paradoxical undressing. This is a known phenomenon where people dying of hypothermia remove their clothing in the final stages. As the body loses heat, the muscles that constrict blood vessels become exhausted. When they relax, there's a sudden rush of blood to the extremities, creating a sensation of intense heat. Victims often tear off their clothes believing they're overheating. This explains why some hikers were found without clothing, and we know at least 3 of them died of hypothermia. But it doesn't explain why they left the tent in the first place, or those catastrophic internal injuries to the ravine floor. Theory 4. Military testing. The region wasn't far from military facilities. Some theorists believe the hikers stumbled upon a weapons test, perhaps involving experimental parachute mines or other ordnance. Orange lights in the sky, flares or rocket tests, massive internal injuries with no external wounds, pressure from an explosion. The sealed case files and government secrecy, a cover-up. This theory has some evidence going for it. The area was used for military purposes, strange lights were reported, and the Soviet government definitely covered things up. But why would military personnel not recover the bodies immediately if they'd accidentally killed civilians? Why let search teams find them months later? And the hikers' cameras and diaries showed no awareness of military activity in the area. Theory 5. The Mansi people. Some early investigators considered whether the indigenous Mansi people might have attacked the group for trespassing on sacred land. Dead Mountain did have spiritual significance, but this theory falls apart quickly. The Mansi were peaceful and had good relationships with Russian hikers. There was no evidence of anyone else on the mountain. The footprints in the snow led only from the tent. No Mansi weapons could cause those kinds of injuries, and members of the Mansi community actively participated in the search and were as baffled as everyone else. Theory 6. Internal conflict. Maybe the hikers had a fight, someone snapped, violence erupted, and in the chaos they fled into the cold. But the bodies showed no defensive wounds, no signs of hand-to-hand combat. The injuries to the 4 in the ravine were far too severe to be caused by fighting, and the diaries and photographs from the trip showed a friendly, cohesive group with no signs of tension. Theory 7, and this is where we venture into the truly strange. Some believe the Dyatlov group encountered something unexplained: the orange lights in the sky, the impossible injuries, the apparent terror that made them abandon safety. Could they have encountered something we don't have a framework to understand? Some form of unknown phenomenon or entity? Look, I know how that sounds. But here's the thing. Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, before his death, gave interviews saying he believed there were things in those mountains that night beyond his ability to explain. He mentioned pressure from authorities to close the case quickly. He spoke about evidence he wasn't allowed to include in the official report. In 2019, 60 years after the incident, the Russian government reopened the investigation. They examined 3 possibilities: avalanche, hurricane-force winds, or slab avalanche. In 2020, they officially concluded it was an avalanche. But many researchers and the families of the victims disputed this conclusion, saying it still doesn't adequately explain all the evidence. Here's what I think happened, and I want to be clear, this is speculation based on the available evidence. I think multiple factors came together in a perfect storm of tragedy. I believe something, whether infrasound, an unusual weather event, or even the early stages of hypothermia affecting their judgment, caused the hikers to panic and leave the tent. Once they were outside in inadequate clothing, hypothermia set in quickly. The group tried to survive, lighting a fire, sharing clothing. Some attempted to return to the tent but died along the way. The 4 who made it to the ravine tried to create shelter, but something happened there. Perhaps a collapse of the snow den they'd created, perhaps a fall into the ravine in darkness, caused their catastrophic injuries. But I'll be honest with you, this explanation still has holes. It doesn't fully account for the missing soft tissue on Ludmila's face. It doesn't explain why they wouldn't take even 30 seconds to grab boots. It doesn't address why experienced mountaineers would set up camp on an exposed slope when shelter was nearby. The truth is, we may never know exactly what happened on Dead Mountain that night. 9 people experienced something so terrifying, so overwhelming, that they chose certain death over staying in their tent. And whatever it was, it took all of their lives within hours. The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most extensively investigated mysteries in Russian history. Books, documentaries, and research papers continue to analyze every detail. The location has become known as Dyatlov Pass, named after the group's leader. It stands as a memorial to 9 young people who went into the mountains seeking adventure and never came home. Yuri Yudin, the only survivor who turned back due to illness, spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened to his friends. He attended every memorial, spoke at every anniversary, and championed efforts to solve the mystery. Before his death in 2013, he said the hardest part wasn't the unanswered questions. It was knowing that his friends' final hours were filled with terror and suffering, and he hadn't been there. The photographs recovered from the hikers' cameras show their final day. They're smiling, they're building the tent, they're making jokes. They had no idea that within hours they would all be dead under circumstances so bizarre that people would still be talking about it 65 years later. So what do you think happened on Dead Mountain? Was it a tragic combination of natural factors, a covered-up military accident, or something beyond our current understanding? The evidence is all there, documented in photographs, autopsy reports, and witness statements. But somehow, it still doesn't add up to a clear answer. That's what makes the Dyatlov Pass incident so haunting. We have all the pieces of the puzzle, we just can't figure out how they fit together. And every time someone proposes a solution, there's always some detail that doesn't quite match. Some piece of evidence that the theory can't explain. 9 people went into those mountains. 9 people died in one night. And after 65 years and multiple investigations by some of the best minds in Russia, we still don't really know why. Maybe we never will. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Or maybe, one day, someone will find that one missing piece of information that makes everything finally make sense. Until then, Dead Mountain keeps its secrets.